Now let's move on to visual storytelling. So a good environment, or any good image should I say, has a narrative, which is something that gives people a reason to look, or gives the viewer a reason to look. So the narrative, it could be complex or it could be simple, but it needs to be deliberate. As we mentioned before, harmony is an incredibly important part of an image. So even if all you'd like to do is make some sort of peaceful lake or river scene, we just have to make sure that that piece seeps into every part of the image. And this is where visual storytelling is important. So the key areas of interest are focus, context, shape language, angles, rhythm, space or negative space, light, and colour. And this is only a small, just like we did with the compositional techniques, this is just a small part. So we will begin with focus and context. Focus being obviously the most important part. It's the whole reason that you're making the image in the first place. So what part of the image do you want people to look at? And it may be a selection of things, and this is where you use a combination of the compositional techniques that we mentioned before. So the area of focus may be obvious, or it could be more hidden, and you can balance the image so this is the last thing that the viewer finds. So the last thing the viewer finds is the most important part, essentially. And this is where context is necessary. Context is your opportunity to fill the space and add supporting elements using the compositional rules that we covered in the previous video. The primary use of these rules that we outlined previously is to help resolve the focus and the context. So this is a really nice image by an artist called Stephen Corman. And I just wanted to use it as a brief case study as he uses these techniques so well. So I'll open it up here just in fresh paint so we can draw over it. And we'll start with the focus. So he does a really good job of making sure that you're looking here, and he does this using first and foremost contrast. He has very dark areas next to very light areas. He also uses colour. He has some nice cold blues against some nice warm yellows. He also uses framing, which is just indicated here from the visor around the alien's head. But not only that, that's his focus of course, but not only that, we have the rest of the scene, which is the context, and everywhere you can see a line. So he's using a line here to take you towards the alien. He's using a line here to take you towards the alien. He's used some subframing here as well. Sorry for that wonky line, but he's used subframing here. He has used, value reduction to reduce the contrast in the background to make sure that you're not distracted by all of this visual information. And he's used a lot of light. Again, this light creates nice shapes that draw you back in towards this part of the scene. So the context has two purposes. First, it enriches the environment and it adds to the narrative. And secondly, it also adds to the composition. So we'll move on from that. I hope that was enough to outline focus and context as a concept. And we will look at what's next. Shape language. So we can add a lot to the story just by the shapes that we choose to use. And an excellent example of this is within the film Arrival, if you've ever seen it. The alien spacecraft is this very unnatural and unusual shape that even if it wasn't floating in midair, it would still feel pretty alien, only because these type of shapes don't normally occur in nature. And this type of shape also helps tell us a story. So softer shapes usually make us feel safe. The opposite being that any sharp or jagged shape that you choose to use will usually introduce danger. Tall, thin structures could be grand or imposing or menacing, and squatter shapes, they tend to be more solid or grounded. So they add a lot of base to your image. So if we just quickly look at some very simple shape language. You're talking about squares. If you add a lot of squares into your image, you're going to get you're going to get a lot of stability. If you go ahead and say we're talking about triangular shapes, so pyramids, it will be even more stable only because all the weight is at the base. So it's very grounded. If we turn that on its head and we look at something like an upside down triangle, then everything's going to become unstable and you're going to add a lot of uncertainty into the image. You know, this is almost self-explanatory. When we look at a spike, we're talking about danger, right? We're talking about something that can kill. The opposite of this being a circle, which introduces safety. It's something that probably isn't going to hurt you anytime soon. So here's an example of how you can use the same shape to change the story, essentially. So we have a long, thin structure, fairly safe. It's not really doing anything. If we couple that up and add something on top, we add a bit more stability. If we change that to one of the pyramid shapes, it adds even more stability because then all the weight is nice and stable and upheld. But the minute that we add some directionality to it or some angles, then we start to create a little bit more instability, but we also start to introduce a little bit more energy to the scene because things begin to look like they're moving. Next up is angles. So these are another narrative choice that we can make to add a different feeling to a shot. So a shot that's dominated by solid horizontals and verticals, coupled with a slow camera move, will feel very stable. So here we're looking again at previously the square, right? So the vertical lines are very, very straight. The horizontal lines are very straight, so everything feels safe. Nothing feels unstable. If we then look at a different building and we see all these angles, what we're seeing is a lot of energy and a lot of chaos. And again, this is a choice, right? And it also adds uncertainty too. And there's nothing more uncertain than, say, a fallen tree. So these diagonals begin to add a lot of energy and a lot of dynamism into the scene. And nothing is more unstable than a ladder without any support. So, I hope that, again, gives you some ideas as to how you can use these diagonals within your own image to try and introduce a sense of energy and dynamism. Next up is rhythm. And we'll look at the Starry Night by Van Gogh. We can imagine the swirls as like some sort of moving river, and you can get an idea of how your eye ebbs and flows around the image. We flow through the sky, swirling around with the clouds, until we're pulled down towards or along the mountains to the cypress tree, which then flows to the bottom of the frame where the buildings are. And this is where our eye hangs and here taking in the details. We can pace the viewer's eye and the attention through the image depending on how much detail that we choose to use to catch their attention. And this can add another energy or a stillness that, even without any extra content, can help support the concept or the idea. The next concept that we want to talk about is space and negative space. So it's important to leave simple areas as an opportunity for your eyes to have a rest. And you can see here we have some groups, and we'll talk about grouping a bit later. But what I wanted to mention at this stage was that we have these large areas where nothing really is happening. And it's very important. And it doesn't just need to be there for context either. It can also change how we feel when we look at the image. So if we look at Mr. Robot, for instance, they use negative space in order to make us feel uneasy by placing the actor on the bottom part of the frame and setting his gaze out of the shot. And this has a bit of a double effect, making him feel alone and making us anxious as we can't quite see what he is focused on. Psycho also uses it perfectly, offering us an idea as to what might be coming by nothing more than just making the curtain the area of the focus rather than Janet Leigh. And this builds anticipation in our own minds, even without him adding in anything else to the image. But negative space isn't just an absence of detail, it's also a choice, allowing us to introduce large shapes in a more subliminal yet clearer way. The shapes we make here could actually be the main focus of the piece. So this is a bit of a strange image to look at. It takes a while for your eye to adjust, but you can see how he has used negative space at either side of this composition. Lighting is an area that we will come back to. I do plan to come back to it because it's so important that we need to give it its own section. Moving on to colour. As an environment artist, especially a landscape artist, our colour palette is easily dictated by the environment that we want to create. Whether that be something like these blue icebergs. This image in particular was created by Dima Kremiansky, who's an artist at Axis Animation. Or maybe some red deserts. Again, this image was created by Stephen Corman. So it's quite easy for our colour choices to be dictated, and in some respects they should be dictated by the environment that we're trying to create. But you don't need to be a slave to this. There is loads of information on colour theory online, and we can look for opportunities to introduce it in an attempt to give our pieces some character. So one of my favourite resources online is colourpalette.cinema. Let me just bring that up, colourpalette.cinema, and it's on Instagram. So and this is a very cool resource which lets you see just how some directors choose to use colour within their image. And it's important to not just look at the colour, but if you have seen the movie that's here, you can try and get an idea of how they have linked the colour of the movie to the colour of the shot. If you're new to colour theory, I would definitely suggest taking some time to look into it. But for the purposes of this demonstration, we'll briefly cover the main points. So, colour by colour. Red would evoke senses of anger or passion. Yellow tends to be a little sickly or friendly even. Green for nature or money. White being something a bit more pure or a bit more simple. Black, mystery and death. Blue, tranquil and peace. Orange, warmth or energy. Royalty or magic for purple. And pink for youth or love. Most of the time when we're working with environments, we will be working with some sort of reduced colour palette, trying to make sure that nothing gets too bright or oversaturated, only because when we move into grading, this will help us a little later, to save us fighting against the render. It's best to think about this at this stage as it's kind of like film or photography, and later we'll cover AOVs, and what they are and what they're for and how we can use them to manipulate the image or the shot. So just to wrap up on colour, when you are deciding on your idea and what it is that you want to create, along with composition, along with using shape language and the various tools that we outlined here, you can also think about colour as another narrative vehicle. Or should I say, you should think about colour as another narrative vehicle using some of these templates outlined here. So I think we'll move on. That's enough about visual storytelling. And next we'll look at the virtual camera and the real camera and what we can take from the real camera into the virtual world. Thank you.